Okay, great. No, thanks very much. So yeah, we were delighted to take part in this initiative, to be one of the 7 studies in this OECD initiative. So we had a big team at Oxera working on this, and yeah, very happy to present a summary of the results and discuss them here with all of you today. So I will give an introduction, and then Lola takes over. So what was our study about? Lola, maybe if we can probably jump to slide 4. So in essence, our study is about the gender data gap, which is the, well, now probably well known and well publicized problem of if you do policy and you don't have disaggregated data by gender, well, how can you make sure that your policies work? So if the data is only aggregated, or worse, if the data is only based on studies of men rather than women as well. So how can you make sure your policies are right? And that gender data gap may well exist in competition policy as well, because in competition law and policy, we tend to do basically almost always all the analysis in the aggregate of consumers, of markets. So what we thought would be a really interesting idea, and it turned out to be a really interesting exercise, is to analyze past consumer surveys that we routinely use for, market definition or merger effects, and actually assess, well, what would have happened, what would we have seen or would have concluded if one had done those surveys disaggregated by respondents, whether they are male or female. So that's what we did. If we turn to the next slide, we were very fortunate, as Chris mentioned, that we had really good cooperation from we spoke to a number of agencies, and we're very grateful in the end that 4 agencies were also forthcoming with, actually they were able to give us data on some of their past surveys. And in addition, we as Oxera have done surveys in the past in a number of cases, so we were able to use some of those with permission from our clients. We cover a whole range of sectors, which is also quite good and was very interesting, from supermarkets and broadband services to sports channels and healthcare providers. In our results, in our report, we present all these results in an anonymous way. So clearly, there's no link back to the actual survey, and also the idea wasn't that we would judge past surveys based on whether they got it wrong or right, but we just wanted to see, what are there any meaningful differences, significant differences in these survey outcomes. So Lola will actually talk more about 2 of the cases, just as examples. But in addition to analyzing these cases, we also have in our report an analytical framework for thinking about this. And then at the end, we also have some lessons for competition policy, and survey design, which we will come back to. But the analytical framework, it is actually quite a simple one, but it's just useful maybe to briefly go through it. So as I said, we are looking to address the gender data gap. So the key question is, when you look at these surveys, is there a difference in consumer behavior? So in the answers by respondents between men and women. What we then also did is, even if there are differences, clearly that could be driven by other demographic features of the respondent. So one carefully needs to analyze that. So income, age, etc. So what we did was regression analysis, or in most of the case studies, we were able to do that, to really try to isolate any differences by gender from differences that are driven by other factors. So, and if we then find, yes, there are statistically significant differences in the answers between men and women, the question then is, what is the impact? Okay, so what does that mean for competition policy? So our framework then also sets out that, so if we go to the next slide, that yeah, what does it mean if there are differences by gender? For example, if we find that men are more price sensitive than women, or the other way around, or that men have certain different preferences for products than women, and the other way around. So the first step is, are there differences? The second step is, okay, but so what? And the so what is really driven by market behaviors, and in particular by whether suppliers in the market, firms in the market, are able to exploit those differences. Because if they are not, if suppliers in the market are not able to make this distinction, then perhaps there is less of a concern, even if consumers have different preferences. But if suppliers in the market can target those differences, as actually happens, of course, in many markets, both in terms of product differentiation, but possibly also in terms of pricing, then you may want to alter your economic analysis of market definition or effects. In all of this, we do have a good, a health warning, which is often referred to as the toothless fallacy, the famous United Brands banana case, which is that, okay, if you look at, in this case, bananas, purchases of bananas clearly differ in their ability to switch. So in the famous United Brands case, the court and commission had concluded that bananas are a separate market because the elderly people and babies can't switch to other fruit. But in a way, the fallacy was that still doesn't matter if banana sellers can't discriminate between buyers of bananas. Other people can buy the bananas on behalf of elderly people and babies. So that is a good, a good sense check that one needs to do. But if there is in the market a tendency or probability that suppliers themselves can target customer groups by gender, then our recommendation really is that you need to take this into account in your analysis of competitive effects. So turning over to Lola now to give some examples.
Yes, thank you, Gunnar. Just to check, can you hear me? Can you hear me well? Yes, excellent. Okay, so I'll now run you through a very high-level, brief overview of our findings of the several case studies that we did, and give a flavor of some of the implications that these findings may have for the specific case or for competition policy more generally. So one of the case studies that we looked at was an investigation into the rights of sports broadcasters, and in particular a remedy that was aimed at ensuring more competition in the market, which was that no single buyer could buy all the broadcasting rights. And so there was a survey that checked the extent to which there was competition in the market, in particular by understanding the substitutability of subscriptions to the two broadcasters. And we reran this survey, but this time looking separately at men and women. And what we found was that a lower proportion of female subscribers was interested in watching all or specific matches. A low proportion of female subscribers was interested in watching one match on both broadcaster channels, and a low proportion of female subscribers was actually subscribing to both channels simultaneously. And what this means is that the remedy that was being discussed would be effective indeed for the female subscribers, because they consider the different broadcaster packages to be substitutes, leading to competition between the broadcasters, whereas for men who see the packages as complementary, it may actually have a negative effect, because instead of one broadcaster being able to buy all the rights, they had to subscribe to two packages with potentially high prices. So that was the first case. Then the second case was one of a merger between two grocery stores, where there was a survey conducted to understand what the customer at that specific grocery store would do in case that it was closed for 3 months. And when we reran the survey separately for men and women, what we found was that a significantly larger proportion of male shoppers would consider the merging party store as the closest substitute. And so this means that following the merger, the grocery stores would have a different incentive to raise prices for men and for women. So when we conducted the illustrative price rise test, which basically looks at the incentive for merging parties to raise prices, we found that for 3 out of 9 stores, the merging parties would have incentive to raise prices for men, while only for 1 store for women. Now, obviously, the extent to which this is possible depends on, first of all, the ability to differentiate, or the effect depends on the size of the group. So, for example, if actually female shoppers make up a very important part of a grocery store's income, maybe the female shoppers are actually able to protect the male shoppers following the merger. And then the third one on this slide is one of package holidays, where there were two of the largest tour operators providing package holidays were notified of their merger. And the market authority in question conducted a survey to understand to what extent separate components exerted competitive pressure on the tour operators in their package holiday offer. And what we found was that women are significantly less likely to compare separate components and package holidays, which means that if a firm is able to exploit this, is able to differentiate its offering targeted to female customers, for example, say they know that it's mostly female customers that are interested in all-inclusive holidays, that they could raise the prices of those products following the merger. Then there was a survey that looked at the switching ratios, in particular one of health insurance, and whether the respondents would switch if their insurance provider wouldn't have a contract with their preferred treatment center. And in this case, we found that women were significantly more likely to switch if the insurance provider didn't have a contract with the treatment center that has that preference. And lastly, we had a look at switching ratios, in particular the study conducted by the Canadian Competition Bureau that looked at switching ratios in terms of service contract provision. And when we looked separately for men and women, we found that men are actually significantly more likely to switch the service contract provider, which means that changes to prices or product offering would affect men differently from women, because if there is a change, it's more likely that men would switch away and still look for the best deal, while women may stick with the provider even if there is a change that they don't like. Then, of course, the very important question, what does this mean for competition policy? And what do these findings mean for future cases? The first step is, of course, to understand whether there tend to be significant differences by gender in terms of whether there are different alternatives for men and women, different switching ratios, etc. In which case it's very important to undertake a regression analysis. We have set this out in a lot of detail in the report. Also happy to answer questions about that later, to understand whether indeed the differences that you see are driven by gender. And then once that has been established, which is quite likely given that in every single case that we studied, there was a significant difference by gender, it is important to understand what the implications are for the specific case at hand. And first, this can be done, as Gunnar mentioned, by understanding the ability to differentiate. So, for example, can a firm exploit these differences by targeting the least price sensitive group, or the group with least alternatives, or that has barriers to switching? But even if this is not possible and they cannot price differentiate, there may be a different effect or a different market definition than previously thought, depending on the size of the group and the level of switching. So if it turns out, for example, that instead of a 50-50 distribution, it turns out that actually women are the most important customer for that firm, it may be actually that for the entire customer group, there may be a negative effect. And so this is also, this has important implications for survey design. So the first question that needs to be asked is gender. Quite surprisingly, there were actually quite a few surveys that did not record gender, quite surprisingly, actually. So that's the first one. And to ask about this in a non-binary way so that you can account for gender in any form of groups. And then second, it is important to ask questions about other relevant characteristics of respondents, in particular age. We found in some studies that age was actually a very important factor that was driving the differences instead of gender. There is marital status, education, employment status, and location. And these are all important to include in the regression to see whether it's indeed gender that is driving the difference or if it's other characteristics. And then the last questions that are important to include are the ones that will enable you to assess the implications of differences by gender. So in particular, understanding price sensitivity and switching ratios by gender, but also a broad question that informs you how important a group is to the revenue of the firms. So are you interested in purchasing this product is a good question to ask up front to understand the potential size of the various groups. So these are our key findings and key takeaways. We want to thank the OECD again for this initiative and allowing us to do this extremely important research. And I'm really looking forward to hearing any of your questions.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, guys. Let me have a quick scan here. No. Let me kick us off with a question. So one thing that you emphasized there was this point about regressing to see whether the difference that you're observing is coming from a kind of a gender effect, or is it something else that's going on in the background. And I suppose when I saw this, I had two sort of thoughts, and I think you've got some lines in the report that kind of pick up on the same thing. So I'm interested in what you make of it. But I suppose on the one hand, I thought, well, yeah, obviously that's definitely going to be important to understand what the pure sort of gender effect is in this case. You're going to need to control for all this other stuff. But then on the other hand, I was thinking, but isn't it likely that the firms are kind of using gender here as a proxy for a bunch of stuff that enables them to make decisions? And so is there a risk of going too far in breaking down, what is causing each piece? And so I suppose I'm interested in if you had any thoughts on, which of those two. It sounds like you think the regression approach is the one to go for, but do you think there are circumstances in which you would still be interested in differences, even if they could be explained by those other aspects?
I think one important reason to understand what is driving these differences is in order to understand which remedy is likely to be effective and how to implement a remedy or market definition. So for example, in the case of the sports channels, what we found is that actually there are indeed differences by whether we're looking at female subscribers or male subscribers, but what was driving this difference was actually age. And it's interesting to understand that because it changes what you are targeting, or you are changing what might be behind any such difference. So our hypothesis in this case was because it is age, so female subscribers fell into the 30 to 40 age group on average, while male subscribers fell into the 50 to 60 age group on average. And so what we hypothesized was that actually this difference is being driven by time. 30 to 40 is more likely to have children and a job and maybe have less time to watch multiple matches. And so that's actually what you should be, how you should be thinking about addressing the remedy, or even how a firm may be exploiting these differences. So I think that is one reason why it is important to understand what is the underlying driver.
Yeah, and just to add, indeed, as researchers or as economists, you do want to understand all the underlying reasons, right? That's sort of our instinct. And once you understand it, then you can target your remedies, as Lola says. But Chris, you do actually raise another interesting dimension, is that, of course, we focused on, are there differences? Is there a data gap between men and women? But you can apply the same methodology along any other dimensions. Other dimensions indeed of diversity and inclusion. So we could have checked it by age or by ethnic background, or other factors. But even then, you do want to unpick the causality and the confounding effects of these various characteristics.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. I think like you say, probably some of this is the journey is the important piece. So getting into that and then knowing what you're going to do with it is kind of the important piece. I suppose I'm just thinking in some cases you might have like unobservable, you might ideally be wanting to discriminate on unobservable characteristics, and all you can do is something like target it towards a gender or something like that as a way to differentiate. But yeah, in any case, getting to the bottom of the issue is the important thing, I guess. Another one that I wanted to dig down a little bit on was, I guess, in a lot of these when we talk about a lot of these factors, we kind of talk about consumer behavior, and I'm kind of interested, especially for the toolkit, in kind of unpackaging a little bit further the components of that, because I think both the presentations today kind of touch upon some of these aspects. In some cases, it seems we're talking about differences in preferences. In some cases, it's price sensitivity. In some cases, it's the direction of diversion. You include a few different sort of aspects in which you can see those differences. Do you think that's something we should drive towards in the toolkit?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it is worth indeed looking at all of those, because all of those come into the competition analysis at different stages, right? When it comes to market definition, well, certainly one thing, the SNP test, you want to look at price and reaction to price changes. Mm-hmm. When it comes to, well, also market definition, of course, preferences come into play, where products are differentiated in a certain way, and then price follows, but it's more about the differentiation in products. Mm-hmm. But also in the analysis of effects, so certainly for mergers, theories of harm from mergers, like it is another theory of harm to potentially explore, like not just are these two stores each other's closest competitors, but could they start doing things like identifying these differences, and then the result of which being that actually in aggregate, it looks like there is no harmful effect on consumers, but actually on specific subgroup of consumers, there could be. So it is, I would say it comes in at various stages of the competition analysis. So yeah, but without perhaps being too precise in terms of delineating exactly where it comes in, because you're right, Chris, we have sort of, we mention all of those, but we don't always neatly distinguish between them.
Sure. Okay. Got a question from Nadia. Nadia, do you want to pose it?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I'll start with a comment. I just want to thank Oxera for this excellent paper. For me, the analytical framework was not only easy to follow and understand, but it's something that, as you've spoken about already, can touch on intersectional issues. It doesn't necessarily need to be restricted just to gender, and I think that's extremely useful as a tool going forward, and it will be central in the toolkit, I imagine. Not that I get to work on that, but I'm looking forward to seeing it when it's done. I think one of the debates that we've had internally that relates to the work that you've done is getting access to data. So you've talked a bit about surveys and creating those and how those can be tailored to help with this kind of analysis. But I wanted to know from you if you've had any advice on other ways of finding that data or strategies and things that might exist out there that might be helpful in that, because I think that's going to be one of the bigger barriers. It's not necessarily, like you've already outlined, a way forward on the analysis. It's just getting the data to do that analysis. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Nadia. Yeah, I think one important way to get data is obviously actual sales data. So looking at past behavior of customers, often gender will be recorded because it's just a very important demographic that most likely firms will be looking at. So I think that will be one avenue that will be very important. And in particular, I think sales data is also important for further research, because what we have noticed actually in our surveys is significant differences in responses when it comes to hypothetical questions or what did you do in the past. So for example, when we looked at the package holidays, there was the hypothetical question of what would you do if you looked at a package holiday, or what did you do in the past? And people may think that they would compare, but whether they actually did it is different. So I think, yeah, looking at past sales data is a really important one for future research.
Yeah, and data is of course generally a theme for competition authorities and practitioners alike. And indeed, we had a good sort of, we also thought about this, as Lola says, in terms of surveys is one, other existing databases is another. And indeed, maybe in the olden days, there were many data sets like, the old-fashioned scanner data in a supermarket, where perhaps it isn't actually recorded, right? Whether the customers, the gender of the customers, because simply it's just scanner data. But these days, clearly in online markets, there is so much data out there on perhaps too much even. But certainly there is a lot of data on, including on demographics like gender, and therefore you could do this kind of analysis also on past data, on past sales, actual sales data, as Lola says.
Yeah, I think about all the reward programs and the cards that people have in their wallets and how much data is actually tied to that. So it's an interesting thing to explore further. But thank you.
And just a quick follow-up, Lola, when you were talking about the difference between the kind of the stated and revealed preferences, were you finding differences across gender in terms of whether there was a difference between those, or?
Yeah, so there were a number of interesting findings. So for one, there were no significant differences between men and women in the case of package holidays. Yeah. It was a hypothetical question. So women were as likely to compare as men in their, if they would assess it. But if they actually looked at past behavior, there was a significant difference. And second, there is a significant difference in I don't know what this is called. There is a term for this, but basically, women are much more inclined to say, "I'm not sure" or "I don't know." Probably rightfully so. It's hard to remember what you did in the past, but so that also gives a very different finding and makes that that it's hard to get statistical significance on responses. So that's also a good reason to use revealed preferences.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. And then, if one further one. In the report, you mentioned that some of the competition authorities have got guidance on kind of consumer surveys and good practice and so forth. Do you think that could be a way, so updating that in some sense might be a step that some agencies could take to act on some of the things that you've found here?
Yeah, it could certainly be a further dimension in the guidance on surveys, but I think the learning has been more the other way around up until now, because we did learn a lot, in particular from the CMA's survey, which I don't know is probably one of the more detailed sets of guidance on actual survey design, and their staff are very experts on survey design. So and speaking to them, we learned a lot from them, and also they gave us good tips on when we do this analysis, look out for these kinds of things and in the survey design. But yeah, a study like this, I think it is generally good practice for authorities to have some guidance for best practice on survey design.
Yeah.
And then this dimension of picking up different demographics, gender or other demographics is an important dimension in survey design.
Yeah, it sounds like it could be a sort of when Ellen was talking about processes and systems and so forth, that maybe that's one way to feed some of this stuff through into the everyday. But like you say, getting that guidance in place in the first place is probably the big step. Okay, anybody else have a question they want to pose? We can pick up a few towards the end, as I say, if something comes to you. But if not, let's move over to Johanna and Marissa. Thank you. Thanks, Gunnar. Thanks, Lola.
Let me just pull up the slides. Does that work for everybody? Great. All right, so first we wanted to start by thanking the OECD and the Canadian Competition Bureau as well for the opportunity for us to speak at the event today and to contribute to this important topic. So my name is Marissa Ginn. My colleague and co-presenter is Johanna Posch, and we both work for the Analysis Group, which is an economic consulting firm. We co-authored the paper that we're going to summarize today for you with three of our friends and colleagues, Lisa Pinheiro, Anne-Catherine Faye, and G. Lehmann. And we also received a lot of support and feedback from a lot of our colleagues as well. And I think the discussion actually and some of the questions bode really, they transition really well to a lot of the topics that we're going to cover today on our slides. So let me get started. So as mentioned by the introductory remarks, is that there's been increasing interest by competition authorities in integrating gender and considerations and investigations, and not only gender, but other equity-based considerations. So some competition authorities have already taken strides in that regard, like the Canadian Competition Bureau, and other authorities. We found quotes by a number of competition authorities voicing that competition policy could be used as a means of promoting equity, including gender equity. And so we took a look at cases, specifically merger cases, to see when gender may have been considered. And it has been considered in some cases. I guess where it's been most obvious, you can think of things like personal care products like deodorants and things like that. But clearly there hasn't been a consistent lens through which gender has been applied. So the goal of our paper is really to try to provide a framework for how to actually consider gender investigations, and specifically in early stages of investigation. So when you're thinking about market definition and when you're thinking about potential competitive effects. And so the key point that we're hoping to get across is some guidance on which factors to consider. And specifically, once you kind of recognize which factors might be relevant, to figure out sources of data that could be used to get that information. So this is going back to one of the questions we got earlier. And so what types of data could be used to try to get the information to determine whether gender might be relevant and the degree to which it might be relevant. So our presentation has three parts. So firstly, we're going to outline the framework. We'll outline the supply and demand factors that we think could be most relevant to consider. And then we'll also provide some concrete ideas of data sources that could be used to evaluate those factors. And then in the second part, we'll show how we applied our framework using an example. So specifically, we collected data using publicly available information online. And then we use that information to apply some sort of standard tools that are used in analyses of competitive effects to see what the impact might be of a hypothetical merger if you can consider it along gender lines and if you didn't. And then the last part of the presentation, we were going to propose some points for discussion and provide some recommendations for future work. All right, so this slide here summarizes the framework that we've put forward in our paper. There are essentially two sides of the framework. There are two sets of factors to consider: the supply side factors and demand side factors. Some of these factors might be more obvious, but some of the factors are less obvious. It's potentially those factors that are the less obvious that might be really important to consider to determine whether or not gender might actually have an impact. So what we've thought about in terms of relevant supply side factors to consider. So when you think of supply side, this is how the products are actually produced, or variants of the product, and how they're specifically targeted towards genders. So this could manifest itself through color, obviously, through the features of the product, through the size of the product, but also through other means, the way the product might be marketed, the type of packaging, the way that the product might be described, the brand aesthetic of the product, and other ways in which supply side factors might be relevant is through the actual sales channel. So we can think of like where the stores might be located, whether the products might be sold online, but they're potentially marketed on websites that are more targeted towards one gender or another, things like that. And then for the demand side factors, this relates more to how individual consumers purchase the product rather than the features of the product itself. So a couple of relevant questions here are: one, whether the majority of the consumers of the product are of the same gender, or how the gender splits in terms of purchases of the product. And another one is whether there may be differences in consumer behavior along gender lines for purchasing behavior. So in economics, we would call it that, we'd say that essentially that there would be different elasticities of demand for the product depending on gender. And so with these factors in mind, we tried to propose types of data that might be relevant to think of or to consider, and how to actually collect information to apply a gender-based lens. And so this again goes back to, I think it was Nadia Vassos that asked a question about potential difficulties in collecting data and how we would actually be able to test the impact of gender. And so we've thought about 4 general categories of data, and some of them are related to others, which I'll mention. But as Gunnar spoke about, there's transaction level or sales level data that is normally produced by the parties if you're considering a merger. So the merging parties would normally produce sales level data. There might be some other relevant information from the merging parties as well. There is data collected via websites, so publicly available information. And then as Oxera, as Lola and Gunnar spoke about just now, survey data is obviously key as well. And so in terms of the transaction level data, as Lola mentioned, oftentimes transaction level data may actually contain an indicator for gender. In cases where it doesn't, it may be possible to infer gender based on other information in the sales level data. For example, product characteristics, whether using the factors we just described above, right? Color, things like that. There might be information also on the sales channel that was used, which could also be relevant to try to infer gender. And to the extent that there might be a time series, so like a available transaction level data over a period of time, it might allow us to trace differences in consumer behavior by gender as well. So transaction level data can be extremely useful. The one issue with transaction level data is it doesn't necessarily provide with a full picture, right? Because it's normally only provided by the merging parties itself. Sometimes authorities are able to get transaction level data from other relevant parties. But oftentimes it's only data for the merging party. So it might not, as I mentioned, provide sort of the whole picture of the market and the potential impact that a change could have on the market as a whole for gender. So other information from merging parties that may be relevant are a number of internal documents that might speak to the types of marketing strategies that they used, how they actually chose to design their product, and whether those choices reflect some gender lens. They might also have documents that track their consumer base and provide insights as to the type of gender split that is targeted to their products. Or they might also have conducted studies to evaluate consumer preferences or behaviors that are gendered for their products. So the third category is data collected via websites. This is the type of data that we actually use to test our framework, which Johanna will talk about next. So I think the key importance of this type of data is that there's a wealth of data. As everybody knows, there's a wealth of data we can now find online. And this online data, so you can get pricing information, you can get product characteristic information. There's also other information that's frequently available, like reviews. And so you might actually be able to get information on customer identity sometimes through reviews. And so this is publicly available information from websites. So it might be possible, ideally, if you can get some sort of related to scanner data, but information from websites as well. You can imagine that if you can get information from Amazon or other big online retailers, that they might be able to provide more details on the types of, on a gender lens, right? The identity of the consumers, and either directly the identity of the consumers, or they could also potentially provide information on the types of products that the consumer looked at during a session. So you could actually infer the gender from there and actually see potential substitution or what the consumer was considering at the time of purchase. So related to this, as Gunnar mentioned, there's scanner data, or there could be data collected from credit card companies or things like that that could be particularly useful in trying to identify the impact of a gender lens on transactions. And finally, one important category of data is obviously survey data that the Oxera team just talked about, which could also include information on sales location. Ideally, it contains information on gender, but as Lola mentioned, that's not always the case. So hopefully that changes. And right, so this is also a really important category of data to consider as well.
Right. Yeah, so basically with this framework in mind, or with these ideas in mind, we try to do in our work is that we would provide an example of how such an analysis could be applied in practice, where we use some of the data points from the sources described above. In particular, we use data collected from websites to obtain information about sort of the gender dynamics of the market. And then we use these data to show how an analysis of competitive effects under a gender lens might look like. And so our example that we chose was the market for wedge shaped razors. And we found this to be a helpful example because this is a product that is strongly and obviously gendered, but it's otherwise pretty homogeneous. So there isn't that much other product characteristic that we sort of had to deal with. And then there is good publicly available data on product attributes, which I will discuss in more detail in a bit. But also it's an interesting market because from a competition perspective, it's fairly concentrated. There's a few new entrants that have kind of tried to shake it up a little bit. So it's also just an interesting kind of product market to consider in terms of the competition perspective. Right, so in terms of applying our framework, in this case, we collect our data from a website of a large online retailer. And to identify the gendered nature of the market, we rely on data on product characteristics. And we obtain those by applying regular expressions to product descriptions to identify some of the characteristics, including the gender the product was marketed to. And from the same source, this is also something Marissa just mentioned, we also were able to collect information on prices and information on the number of reviews. So if we can go to the, so this is kind of an example of the type of information you could get from an online source. Here, very simply, the product description just includes the words women or men, so you can directly extract that and interpret this through a gender lens. In other cases, features might be a bit more subtle. You might need to rely on the color, for instance, but here we can also clearly see, there's a pink razor and there's a blue razor, so it wouldn't be all that difficult to interpret, actually. And another thing to note here is that we can already see that there is price differences between the product for women and for men. So there is the pink tax. And this is something that, might be worth looking out for as we evaluate the effects of a hypothetical merger to see, what it would do to this pink tax. Right. So I'll keep this pretty short because we actually spoke about this sort of analysis pretty much at length in the last presentation we gave in February. But in the next step is basically to use the data, as I said, to use the data we've collected to apply some common tools that would be used in a merger assessment. And in this so here we would just sort of look at a hypothetical transaction between two of the brands that we've seen in our data. And the purpose of this exercise is sort of really just to show how collecting data on gendered product characteristics and applying a gender lens to the analysis may impact some of the conclusions that we draw compared to sort of doing a gender blind approach. So we do two specific things here. The first is just we use market share proxies that we sort of get from the number of reviews to do kind of a naive evaluation of HHI increments, so changes in the level of concentration in the market post this hypothetical transaction. And we also run a merger simulation. And we do both of these things, sort of once considering that there may be distinct markets for male and female products, and once assuming that we would be looking at a common market and not really care about the gender issues at all. And what we find actually is that, well, the HHI increment of our hypothetical merger is actually quite a bit larger in the female-only market than it would be in the overall market. The industry price change that is predicted in our simulation in the market for women's racers is higher than in that for male racers or the overall. And this means also that that the pink tax that we had already seen on the baseline could get exacerbated by this hypothetical transaction. So all this is to say that collecting and using the appropriate data and applying a gender lens to the competitive assessment of a merger or another antitrust investigation can have an impact on the ultimate conclusions that we would draw from the analysis. You're on mute.
Got it. So as we were working on our paper and thinking about our framework and sources of data, et cetera, it sparked obviously a number of ideas of other ways that where this could be relevant to apply. So first, we think there might be other contexts in which it might be relevant to apply a gender lens and to apply the framework more generally. One is for labor markets. There's been growing interest across many jurisdictions also about competition in labor markets and inequalities along gender or racial or other lines. So the supply and demand side factors we outlined in our paper are really applicable to product characteristics, but there are some natural counterparts that you can think of in labor markets, such as supply side channels. So the supply side factors would be analogous to things like job application channels or recruiting, those types of things. Another area that we thought that this could be relevant to think of is also in antitrust, but in cases involving damages. So you can think that of maybe considering gender lens in damages cases. You might reveal that there are actually differences into the degree of injury or even whether there was any injury across different groups of consumers. In terms of what this might mean or how this might be helpful for competition agencies, clearly the paper was focused on enforcement activities, but there are also advocacy and compliance activities as well that thinking about this type of framework might be relevant to. And as mentioned by others as well, and even in opening remarks, is that it's not necessarily only gender that this would necessarily apply to. You could think of other ethnicity and race and income levels, mental and physical disabilities, and all kinds of other factors that would define distinct consumer groups as well. So there's more details in our paper, and we thank you very much for taking the time to listen to our presentation, and we really look forward to discussing and any questions you might have.
Great, thanks very much. Let me start with one, and this one, it goes a little bit to something I was mentioning to Gunnar and Lola. I think that the illustration that you provide for me was really useful in terms of I guess showing that you have this that you can have that differential effect simply through the different kind of preferences and willingness to pay for the products, right? Even without even getting to elasticities, you've already shown the sort of the impact this can have and the implications of getting that wrong. So that, I think for me that's quite helpful in sort of setting out that we need to step through some of those things, and you kind of need a multi-level analysis of some of those factors. Do you think is that how you guys?
That's how that we've been thinking about it as well. And I mean, so in our paper, we also consider, so I think it's, you sort of see whether or not there's something obvious, and then you try to think, well, there might not be something obvious, but is there something there?
Yeah.
And then you could walk through these various exercises and steps to try to determine the effect. But one thing that we've also tested out in our paper is obviously the publicly available data doesn't really allow you to test for market and own price elasticity. So we also considered, there are other ranges of potential elasticities that might matter. And depending on the elasticities that you consider, you might get very different estimated impacts. But this sort of provides a framework for, I think, competition authorities evaluating these types of things of like, okay, well, where does this matter? What ranges could this type of behavior actually be most impactful and not?
Yeah, I found the kind of the framework that you set out really useful in terms of classifying those different things. And I was trying to think, what's is there good practice out there that you came across in terms of applying some of those sort of frameworks, or any competition agencies that you'd seen that were using a framework for thinking through these issues?
We did a little bit of investigation. I mean, the framework came in part from looking at cases where a gender lens was applied in the past.
Yeah.
Right. So there was a Unilever merger, for example, and looking at the types of factors that they had considered in why they had defined, markets along gender lenses,
Yeah.
sort of a starting factor. We also did look a little bit at the Canadian Competition Bureau's gender-based plus approach, things like that. But we weren't able to find anywhere that had sort of like a concrete or laid out framework in that way. So that's why we were hoping that that would make sense to do that for our paper.
No, it's a good contribution. I mean, I think at one point you set out a nice sort of set of bullet points that I think maybe it was the Unilever merger, where they kind of gone through the different criteria that they used in the particular case. And at first I was thinking, oh, well, that's a nice kind of example of a framework that you could use. But then I thought it kind of seems to be running essentially off the fact that you could observe the product characteristics in the first place. So So then I sort of thought, well, maybe that's a good framework if you know already, but maybe we need a bit of a different approach, like the one you kind of suggest for those where it might be unclear.
Exactly. Yeah, less obvious.
One that it would be useful, I was interested to hear more about, was your recommendation 4, where you were talking about whether advantages of adjusting the current metrics versus kind of thinking of new metrics to use. I was interested to understand a little bit more what you had in mind there.
Well, when we were thinking about, for example, like there's sort of standard thresholds for changes in HHI that authorities normally consider, or changes in prices like the 5% for the SNP and that type of thing. So what we were sort of thinking is that if there is a specific target of policy to try to target gender equity, that it might make sense for maybe competition authorities might want to consider redefining their targets based on what their policies, what type of policies they might have in mind. And one of the reasons we saw that too is that if you look at the pink tax, for example, in the exercise that we performed, there was an existing pink tax, and we see that the price change for women is substantially higher than the price change for men. It doesn't necessarily reach that 5% threshold, but because there was already a pre-existing price differential between the two genders, whether or not there might be, some potential desire for competition authorities to consider that, depending on certain circumstances, they might not want to apply the common thresholds that they've always been applying.
Okay. So not just to tailor down the analysis and look at that closer level, but then to say, is our sensitivity to the risk there being an issue here? Do we change that? I see. No, I think that's really interesting. Does anybody else have any questions they want to put up? Happy to call upon anybody. One other one that struck me, and I don't know if this is of general interest, but certainly this point around on the cartel damages side. Oh, sorry, Nadia, I'll come to you in a sec. Finish my flow. On the cartel damages side, I was just interested with this point about the commonality of harm that we might see in some of these, which struck me as really interesting. And there, I guess, I suppose that cuts to some of the maybe to the market definition sort of issues again as well, in terms of at what point do we think that all the differences in consumer behavior that are going on under the surface that may not be related to gender or age or race or what have you, there's always going to be some lack of commonality, isn't there, across those? So I guess that's more a legal question really for the sort of the courts on how where they draw that line, given the exposure of these kinds of differential impact analysis sort of pieces.
Yeah, I mean, we've been working on a lot of consumer class action type of cases where you see like the whole group of consumers, join together. And so when we were thinking about this gender lens aspect, it kind of came to mind of like, oh, well, this potentially has a lot of impact on how these different consumers within this broad group would be impacted.
Yeah, it makes you think, yeah, I don't know that. Yeah, within each class, you're necessarily going to have. Well, anyway, I don't know. That's a question for another day, maybe. But the diversity of class groups is obviously a big challenge in these things. Nadia, you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. This is a fairly narrow question, but I'm interested to know the answer. When it came to looking at things like for the non-obvious markets where you don't have the pink and the blue and the different products that say men and women's, and you're going deeper to find that kind of information, did you use an automated tool to get that, or were you actually manually going through to find that kind of information using reviews and other things? And the reason I asked that question is that feels like it would be very resource intensive. So if there are automated tools out there, that would be really helpful to know about, or any tips you would have for making that process a bit easier.
So we did use automated tools because we collect a lot of pricing information. And we did look, we considered other products as well when we were doing our review. There's a number of ways in terms of, looking at regular expressions and trying to extract relevant information. And in our research, we also found that there are some studies, some academic studies that look at things like, for example, associating names with gender. Obviously, it's not perfect, but there are studies that have found that, I can't remember the exact percentage, but I think it was like over 90% of the time they actually have a bank of, the authors actually have a bank of names that they have with the most common gender associated with those names. There's also studies that look at reviews of products, as Johanna mentioned as well. And you can use tools like there's natural language processing, for example, that allows you to try to extract, relevant portions of the comments. And there are tools that could associate those also with, whether those types of comments have been left on some much more clear gender products, or that same reviewer has left reviews on something that's much more clearly gendered, to try to associate a gender with a specific reviewer. So yeah, I think there are a number of automated tools to consider, and I'm happy to follow up if you want to talk about it a little bit more, because we spent quite a bit of time thinking about what types of tools might be most relevant and how they could be applied.
Yeah, I think it's going to be relevant for the toolkit in terms of practical steps people can take when they're trying to do this. So I think that'd be really interesting. I'm just going to add another question because I have the floor. One of the things that comes up in the debates is whether adding this kind of analysis is a value judgment. So if we're going to decide a merger on the effects, like the 2.8% increase when it comes to women's razors that you guys mentioned, what would be your response to that?
Whether or not considering gender is a value judgment, or whether or not the blocking of a potential merger based on a 2% increase would be a value judgment. Is that your question? Is the latter or the former?
Yeah, it's a bit of a cheeky question, just because sometimes we have trouble convincing people that there's really an economic issue there, and we're not just favoring women to make a benefit for women.
I mean, I think like one of the points that we also thought about a lot in our paper was that we think there's actually, completely on the basis of established, ideas and tools in market definition, we may be a bit blind to certain factors that differentiate markets that we just don't really look at the moment, but we feel like we maybe need more tools and more data to be able to carve those out. And that's sort of one of the things that so not even changing the economics of what we think would be right to do, but just like giving authorities the tools for something that they would actually do anyway, because it's just the basic economics of these kinds of cases. And then you can, I guess, think further, and that goes more into the value judgment kind of sphere where the kinds of points that we raised about a pink tax, and do we need to be sensitive, like do we want to actively promote, should like equity concerns be an active desire, beyond what we're already doing in terms of consumer protection, I suppose. And there it goes into the value judgment. But many of these things, I think, is just about giving, sort of just using the tools we already have a bit better and with a bit more of these gender considerations in mind.
Yeah, thanks. That's helpful. My personal view is that if we have the data, we can consider it. If we don't have the data, we can't consider it. So how do we take it into account? And the effects are going to be different in every case, but with that knowledge, we can use it and make that judgment if we need to, but with open eyes and understanding the issues. But, thanks. I loved your paper.
I think that's right. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think, in a sense, especially when you were talking about like the kind of the threshold for taking a closer look, maybe that's the really interesting one for me in terms of maybe we don't say that you have differential thresholds or something for making decisions, but maybe there is a case to say at a high level we see things like pink tax or whether it's the equivalent in racial terms, and so maybe we want to be a bit more cautious in making sure we take a close look to make sure that we haven't missed something, and so maybe that involves a bit more flexibility on thresholds. I don't know how these are always applied by different agencies, so maybe that is already kind of something that's feasible to do. But yeah, that rings true, I think. Okay, I think our time is up, but until we get pulled back into the main room, we more than happy to continue taking any questions people have. Also to Gunnar and Lola, if anybody has questions for them.
Or maybe, Chris, can we ask a question to you and the OECD?
Please do.
Maybe sort of when you think about next step and guidance, is it actually going to be like concrete guidance, like in market definition, take into account gender? Or is that what you envisage? Or
I mean, I can no longer speak for the OECD, so I will speculate. All I can say is I think when we started out on this project, we did want to be able to put together very practical steps that were there. I mean, I think the strength of the guidance would be a different question as to what you should and shouldn't do. But I think certainly in terms of putting out a menu of options that agencies could see and put into practice within the course of their work, that was the hope that we could come up with those. Yeah, I think it'll have to be I don't imagine it would go so far as a full kind of, it would be a guidance, if you want to achieve this kind of thing, then these are the steps that you could take towards that, I would think, in any case. But and so yeah, it's pulling, I think these are two projects are great in terms of the really practical approach to the changes that could be made. I think the other projects speak a bit more to the sort of institutional structures and systems around some of that, but at least here we're coming up with some of the pieces that could make the difference within that. Did you have any questions? I guess you've read one another's paper. I haven't followed the discussion over the piece. If feel free to throw something at one another.
I don't think we need to throw things at one another.
They fit together very, very well as a pair.
They did. I was very pleased to see that, actually. Yes, it's perfect.
That's good. That's good.
I guess one question I have for Lola and Gunnar is, so you considered surveys where there was like a clear identifier for gender, right? One where there was like basically a field in the data for gender. Were there surveys where there might have been ways of identifying genders, to get back at what we were talking about with potentially using names or potentially using product descriptions or things like that you think could have potentially been used? I'm just getting back to the question of like, sometimes it's hard to do this kind of analysis because you don't necessarily have the data, but I'm wondering if there are cases maybe where the data could be used to infer something, potentially not exactly, but in a way that still might be helpful. Did you see that type of information in the data that you looked at?
So actually, due to privacy concerns, a lot of the data that we have does not contain any of that type of information. It is anonymized far enough not to be able to get the identity of the respondent. So although I didn't actually cross our mind to do it that way, which would have been another way of going about this study, but in reality, most data sets wouldn't have allowed us to do that.
There may well be, of course, so not in our study, as Lola says, but there may be, types of markets, industries where that's exactly what companies do, like in insurance, and where they're not allowed to discriminate by gender, but they can find other ways, clever ways, like the color of your car and that kind of thing.
Right.
I have a question for you, actually, for the analysis group, because one element that we struggled with from time to time is stereotyping, and kind of going into the analysis with certain assumptions of behavior of men and women. And this approach of kind of trying to identify gender on the basis of certain characteristics kind of already makes this assumption that there are these differences. How did you account for that? Or how did you make sure that indeed those assumptions were correct?
So I think the idea that we put forward, and Johanna, feel free to chime in, but the idea was that for the framework is that these are sort of starting points of hypotheses of factors that might be relevant, and then to actually then go ahead and try to collect data and test whether or not they are relevant. So I think you're right in the sense that there are potentially assumptions or hypotheses that are made from the start, but our hope was that we would include or point out not only the ones that are most relevant, like potentially the color of the product, but also get people thinking about other factors that could be relevant to consider that may not be so obvious.
Yeah, and it might still be something, I mean, it's true, sort of this idea, so we say pink and blue, right? But we automatically think, right, so pink is for the women and blue is for the men. And so obviously, kind of, you still would need to go a bit and test this hypothesis. And then if you have pink and blue in the data, maybe you find an auxiliary data source to verify that this is actually, you're building on a correlation that makes sense. I mean, I guess these are all tests that you probably need that we didn't get into much detail with, but you're right that this should be avoided, that you're sort of assuming something is gendered in that way that you think it's gendered, and then you build all your analysis on this hypothesis, which is probably that you're right that one probably needs to be careful about that and test this very carefully.
Good stuff. Okay, I think if there are no other questions, we'll leave there. I understand we need to wait for the other sessions to wrap before we return to the main room, but I'll let people turn their screens or what it may be while we wait for the wrap up. Thank you, everyone. Thanks a lot. Really good presentations.